Welcome to the Digital Patient, where we discuss the latest advancements in digital patient engagement and share stories from the front lines. I'm your host, Alan Sardana, and with me as always is SeamlessMD CEO, Dr. Joshua Liu. Today, we're joined by our very special guest, Sara Vaezy. Sara Vaezy is the Chief Digital Officer for Providence, where she is responsible for digital strategy, product innovation, marketing, digital experience, and commercialization for the integrated delivery network, which includes 52 hospitals, 1,085 clinics, and serves over 5 million unique patients. Sara is the architect of the Providence Digital Innovation Model, upon which the Digital Innovation Group was founded, resulting in company partnerships and incubation of technologies that deliver value for Providence, as well as other health systems. The model has resulted in commercialization of 3 incubated technologies into independent companies from within DIG, all of which are supporting Providence and delivering on its mission and vision of health for a better world. Sara is active in the broader healthcare industry, serving as an NCQA board director, as a member of the inaugural class of the Frisk-Cressy Ventures Collective, Health Evolution Forum Fellow, World 50 Digital 50 member, and a Forbes Business Council member. She has won numerous awards and has been recognized as a Business Insider 30 Under 40 Transforming the Future of Healthcare in 2019, Catholic Health Association Tomorrow's Leader 2019, a Becker's Rising Star in Health IT 2020, and a Becker's Women to Watch in Health IT 2020 and 2022. She holds an MHA and an MPH in Health Policy from the University of Washington School of Public Health and BAs in Physics and Philosophy from the University of California, Berkeley. Sara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
Amazing. We are super excited as well. Sara, you've led an absolutely thrilling career so far that's been completely immersed in healthcare. You started in research and you shifted to health policy, and then you actually went the consulting route. And now for the past 6 years, you've been an invaluable operator within Providence Healthcare, and specifically Providence's Digital Innovation Group as their Chief Digital Officer. Now, I know when you first joined Providence, you were brought in as the chief of staff for the digital team, and then slowly shifted over to the VP and Chief Digital Strategy Officer. But I'm curious to know, how did you first end up in the wonderful world of digital health?
So this was, 6.5 years ago. Digital health was not really what it is today. We've seen such an explosion and a lot of really exciting activity in digital. But at the time, it was still relatively nascent, especially when it came to health systems and how they were thinking about their digital agendas and their, sort of digital transformation journeys. I was really fortunate to, through basically serendipity, get to meet the previous chief digital officer for Providence, Aaron Martin, who was my boss, my mentor for 6 years, and got to know him, again, very serendipitously. I was actually building an innovation arm for a client at the time, and we interviewed the Providence folks to learn more about what they were doing, because Aaron was the first chief digital officer in healthcare. There wasn't that much activity still in digital at the time, and so just got to learn more, and through a set of very lucky interactions, was asked to join the team, and throughout that process, just came up to speed very quickly on technology and digital and what it meant to be an operator in a health system. That was my first time doing that. So it was luck. It was a lot of right place, right time, and I really just had the benefit of amazing mentorship and a really interesting, innovative system that was willing to take that risk very early and saw where things were heading, as opposed to just wanting to kind of do things the way they always had in the past.
And Sara, we've talked to some other chief digital officers who maybe started off in the consumer industry world, but you've been a healthcare lifer, right? You did your MHA, your MPH, you've consulted. Do you mind taking us back to, how did you first get into healthcare? Like, where did that drive come from?
So my initial I would say, foray into healthcare was actually more on the translational research side of things. So I was a research scientist at a medical device company that built therapeutic ultrasound intravascular catheters for drug delivery. And I had done quite a bit of research in other forms of therapeutic ultrasound for hemostasis, which is stopping bleeding, and for tumor ablation, so supporting cancer patients. So I'd done all of this work that was adjacent to healthcare proper, but it was really, research oriented. And as I did that work, I was so fascinated by how the systems supported the intake of new innovations and research and devices and technology. And I started to go down the path of learning about the systems, learning about the policies that enable us to do these things systematically across an entire country, how we pay for them, how we regulate them, et cetera. And that's where I decided to make the transition and learn really more about how the healthcare system functioned. That's when I got my MHA and my MPH. And then I wanted to take my quantitative skills from being a researcher and my interest in the healthcare system more generally and apply it to multiple clients. And that's where consulting really came in for me. And so got to do that, but then felt this like sort of existential pull toward being more on the inside as opposed to on the outside, which is fundamentally, as a consultant, it's always very difficult to get in and make real impact or own that impact. You're always making recommendations and then moving on. So that was how I kind of found myself here. Always was very interested in healthcare. My family is healthcare focused. My mom is a pharmacist. My dad works for the FDA actually as a scientist there. So had always some connection, but it was not a linear journey to get to where I am today.
No, that's awesome. I think it's so common as well, the serendipitous elements where it just seems like pieces come together in the right way and then it kind of merges into something beautiful. I'm really curious, Sarah, to learn about your experience with healthcare policy and how do you think that's actually shaped what you're doing with the role of digital transformation today?
The most direct way I can describe it is, and the connection that I see is around change and driving change and change management. Policy creation, so much of it is about seeing what's possible and not just doing the same old thing that you've always done, right? You're always trying to kind of change the arc of how we serve at the highest level and how we structure, how we build systems, how we pay for them. And it is very slow and very process oriented, but fundamentally it manifests itself in sort of change management of like large constituencies, large groups of people, all with vested interests. And that was the biggest connection I see to what we do in digital, which is that it's fundamentally different. It's not just about building technology or ingesting technology that allows you to do something different. It's also about changing your business model. And in order to do that, you have to tackle at the most fundamental level those issues around vested interests and incentives and how people consumer behavior and how consumers access care, how they do different things, right, and their expectations. And so the closest I can describe, like the closest corollary, I guess, is really around that change management, getting people to come along with you, to understand the story and to engage around it, and this kind of vision for like where we need to head.
And sorry, maybe just to dig in more to the digital side now, lots of health systems now are saying they need a digital front door strategy. And I think what Al and I have found is that if you talk to different health systems, they are often defining digital front door very differently. Now, yourself and Providence were one of the earliest pioneers from what we've seen of the digital front door. So today, though, like, how are you thinking about your framework for the digital front door? What does that mean for Providence?
Well, we reject the notion of a single digital front door. There are, especially, I mean, that's the beauty of the internet, right? Like, there are nearly an infinite number of front doors, and Google is like, one big one. There's our own websites. There's all sorts of third parties out there. There's our owned properties, partner properties, Google. There's a huge, vast world, and so there are different channels and different ways by which we can engage folks, and that's how we think about it. And sort of when we break it down to kind of basic principles, one is to be present in as many of those channels as we possibly can be. Another is to be up to speed and deeply engaged with Google, which is the owner of the internet, at least today. And then another principle is around personalization. So be personalized. So be where they are, really interact with Google, and then do so in a way that's relevant to the individual. Personalization is the future. And when it comes to digital transformation in most industries, personalization is a key element of that. When we think about e-commerce, for instance, and the king of all e-commerce, Amazon, your front page looks different from my front page because we have different buying patterns. We're different people. I live in Seattle, you live where you live, like we all have different, all sorts of data that informs who we are and that makes it, our propensity for buying specific things. And that is no different in healthcare, except for that our objectives are different. We're not just trying to get people to buy stuff. We're actually trying to improve health outcomes and so on. So personalization is a key part of this channel strategy. So I would take it away from the concept of digital front door and say there's a broader channel strategy around serving up to the individual a personalized experience. That's how we think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I think, from some of the other guests that we've had on the show that are in the digital world, oftentimes there's different scopes of what they're responsible for. Mm-hmm. And you've shared in the past, this new role that you're in really consists of three main responsibilities. The first bucket is marketing and digital experience. The second bucket is product development. And the third one is strategy and commercialization. I'm curious, because that is such a large umbrella, how do you decide what to focus on from each of those buckets today?
Yeah, those while they're distinct in terms of the functions themselves, they work very closely together in our organization, and they all operate at that kind of consumer or patient-facing front end of the organization. And the fundamental kind of thesis around digital transformation in most other industries, travel, banking, et cetera, commerce, has been that digital, the first place where you can really affect change around the business model is around generating demand, aggregating demand, and capturing demand. And that's what we do with respect to owning this consumer-facing front end of the organization. So those three pieces fit together in terms of customer acquisition, retention, engagement, and here's fundamentally how they work together. So we are doing a tremendous amount of work around knowing who our customers are, and then being able to, or potential customers, being able to do targeted outreach to them so that they can get the care that they need, converting them into our ecosystem, and then building an identity around them so that they can have authenticated, personalized experiences. The technology that we're building, so we're doing that through our marketing activities, and then the technology that we're building is what's driving that identity-driven engagement experience. So essentially, we're incubating technology that our teams, our operating teams, our marketing team, our digital experience team, and our clinical and operations teams outside of that can utilize to drive those engagement experiences. So they all kind of work together. And then the last piece of it is that commercialization piece. So when we build technology is, and we've got Joshua here, so he's a technology CEO, so he knows it's very resource intensive to build technology, and the constraints of a health system make it such that you can't compete at the same level if you own that technology over the fullness of time. So we build technology, but then we spin it out. We create new companies so that we can take advantage of, in the best way, right? Take advantage of the funding and the broader market that's out there to make these technologies more relevant and accelerate the roadmap. And so that's why we do commercialization. We want to, kind of free ourselves from the constraints of the health system while taking advantage of the really great aspects of a health system, which is access to subject matter experts, leveraging that intrinsic trust that we have with people to be able to know what they need and be able to serve it up to them, having access to the data, the technology environments, all that stuff. But we take that company, spin it out, and then we deploy those resources again to the next set of problems, right? So all of these things are sort of mutually reinforcing and they work together, even though they are distinct functions.
So Sara, the incubation piece at Providence is so fascinating, so unique. We've seen a few different ways that you've spun out companies. So we had Mike McSherry from Self on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was, I guess, an entrepreneur in residence, brought in, uncovered a problem with Zelf, and then spun it out of Providence. You've, I think, incubated things completely from internal. I think Dexcare, might have been just purely incubating, then you spun it out. Congrats on that. I want to dig into Dexcare a little bit later as well, because I know that's a big thing that you're supporting now. But I was wondering, when you're actually building that internally and incubating it, like one of the risks you might run into is the fact that this might be a Providence only problem that you're solving. And then when you go to market, do you realize that no one else actually needs this problem solved? So when you're incubating something at Providence, how do you actually figure out if there is a path to product market fit even outside Providence?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because that is like our whole premise, right? Is that this is a market problem that needs to be solved. So some of it is can be addressed just by the nature of Providence itself, because we've got a complex technology ecosystem. We have 3 instances of Epic, so it's almost like 3 different installs, right? Like it is a very large Epic deployment, but there are 3 instances. We have like 7 different regions that we operate in, and they all have their own individual dynamics. So they're all unique and almost operate like mini health systems within a larger health system. So we get some validation around like, this isn't just one unique little idiosyncratic problem to one system throughout our internal process. But we also look externally. So whenever we're going to start up a new effort and a new vertical development effort, we go and we interview tons of people. So and when I say tons, that's the technical term for like the last time we did this, we interviewed about 250 people, half of them internal, half of them external. And we take there's a tremendous amount of breadth. So folks in the regulatory environment, folks that are in the payer environment, we look at all the sectors, we go really deep on the provider side. And so we try to get a market perspective. And then throughout our process, that's kind of in the just understanding the problem phase. Then we go and we kind of get a thesis around what the problem is, do a build buy analysis. We get additional market kind of validation there. If we find companies, we can compare against them. We can kind of start to understand what the landscape looks like. If we ultimately then decide to build, we continue to hone the thesis around what we're building, why we're building it, what the problem is. And throughout that process, we do things like voice of customer research. So we go out, we continue to interview health systems, often in a blinded way, so that they're not influenced by the way we're seeing the problem or the way we're building or the fact that we're Providence, right? We go and we interview folks and again, continue to hone so we understand that this is a market problem. We do a lot of kind of upfront de-risking because we don't have the market structure or the margin structure, to like experiment a whole lot, right? Like that's not, we are relatively risk averse. And what I'll say is like, our funnel starts really broad and it gets very tight very quickly. So we don't take very many shots on goal. In this last iteration, we had a list of like 100 or so problem statements, and we are now building around 2 verticals, right? Wow. So it gets very, very narrow very quickly. With Dexcare, it was a similar thing. We went through that process and vetted it a lot before we got to the phase where we were like, hey, this is something we're going to put a tremendous amount of resource behind and get it out as a, sort of independent market validated solution.
And so I'm just curious, like for something like Dex to happen, like was it that, like, does your group say, hey, like I'm making this up, but like every 2 years we want to incubate and launch a new company? And so you have all these ideas and you're intentionally narrowing it down to something to focus on for the next year or two? Or was it that people internally kept coming to you with the same problem and then you just went after it and it was a little more organic? Because I know like some companies are very intentional where they start with the thesis that they want to build something in that space. Others are more like organic. People are running to you with problems. How does that work at Providence?
If I said it was like, I'm not, this won't be like a purist kind of answer. So it's a little bit of both. But what I would say is we often lead with, is it a significant enough problem? And with the example of DexCare, for instance, it was, we started with sort of these high level problems like, we've got folks that are trying to get into primary care. They're not established patients. They're new patients kind of out in the wild, and it takes them 6 weeks. And so they go elsewhere. They get care at some other system, or they go to some other like emerging disruptors in the market. That was our initial kind of hypothesis, or the initial problem that we identified. And then we were saying, well, maybe like the hypothesis around, and of course I'm simplifying this whole journey. It was a 5-year journey, but maybe we can solve it through on-demand care, right? And then we just started to go down that path to understand what that meant a lot better. And so it really was like, we lead with the internal need. The internal need is really important because if we don't identify that, like it's very hard to get folks in health systems to engage. They've got so much going on. And we need to have an internal champion and a partner that can work with us on the operational side of things. And then the commercialization approach is sort of like the way that we can keep this going sustainably, because you can only work at so many problems at once. If we just kept these things in house, like we'd be tapped out, right? And so we just so that's second. First is fulfill the need and make sure that we're solving that big problem for our system.
And sorry, I don't want to go off schedule too much, but this is just like really, really cool. So congrats on all that. I was wondering, where does that entrepreneurial DNA come from? Because I've seen some health systems where they've maybe tried to start a company, but it never goes anywhere. Or there are others that are just as large as Providence, but they're not doing anything like this. So it's clearly not just you have to be large enough to do this. There's clearly some entrepreneurial innovation DNA at Providence. Like, where does that come from, and like, what keeps that going?
I don't know if there's a single answer to that. It was Aaron certainly introduced a lot of that and that cultural kind of mentality when he started the group 8 plus years ago. We've hired amazing entrepreneurial type people who have experience from big tech or startups. And we've just kind of cultivated it over time, I would say. There's not like a single silver bullet. I think we were just trying to solve the problem, which is like, how do you solve these problems repeatably for the system and do so in a way that's sustainable? And like the pieces kind of came together. This wasn't how it started, right? Like at the beginning, when we started this, we were building all sorts of things, doing a lot of research projects, a lot of like kind of science project type things that didn't have a clear path. We did kill a bunch of projects because we hadn't done all this de-risking up front. And we just learned along the way. And I think it was that openness to learning and the support of like the CEO who had our back the whole time to say like, this is the right thing to do, and went along and like this with us in this journey. Like that was essential. If we didn't have that, it would have been a non-starter to begin with. So we kind of figured it out along the way, and we're going to continue to innovate, right? Like this model, it's health systems are going through a lot right now. It's been a historically challenging, of course, 2.5 years, but this year in particular, like the whole nature of health system business is now different than it used to be. And so we're going to need to continue to innovate and figure out, okay, what's the next iteration of this to make this sustainability equation work even better.
That makes a lot of sense. When you first started the group, or when Aaron Martin first started the group, like how big a team was it? Because I know it's now over 200 plus people internally, all working out, these different problems. But how small was the group back then?
It was, so when I joined, I'll comment on it this way. When I joined 6.5 years ago, it was about 150 people, and we're about at the same now, but the nature of the group has changed, right? Yeah. So as we've honed our thesis around like, what are we trying to do within the system, this sort of notion around supporting the front end, this demand aggregation and capture piece, the pieces of the group have changed. And so marketing was not part of the organization to begin with. And we realized like that's a really key element to all of this, is how you do customer acquisition, how you think about it connected to your digital experience. And then next level is your omni-channel experience, which we'll be starting to explore. And so, and then how do you build platforms that can support that? So it has morphed over time, but the team is about 200 folks right now. And I don't think it'll be bigger than that, right? That's not the intent. The intent is actually to keep it around this size, but to continue to do interesting things.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the main reasons why I bring that up, Sara, I believe it was Providence's CEO who actually used to share kind of a Venn diagram type image with you, basically showing tech people on one side and healthcare people on the other, and basically saying the intersection is where the magic happens. If you can really get those two groups to communicate, that's where you can make magic. And you are really in a unique position leading this team of 150, 200 people, various disciplines. You have computer engineers, like you said, you have marketers, you have data scientists, you have business folks, all under the same umbrella. And so I'm curious, how do you facilitate knowledge sharing between these different groups with the clinicians as well, to really ensure that that intersection is realized?
Yeah. So within the team, like you said, it's a diverse team of a lot of different skill sets, folks who've spent a lot of time in healthcare, folks who are new to healthcare. And we do a lot of communicating. We do a lot of like, just let's get clear on what our goals are, why, what are we trying to accomplish? How does it connect to the mission? That's actually a really important element of it, because a lot of folks, especially in Seattle, they have a lot of options. And in the new virtual environment too, they can work anywhere, they can do anything. There's lots of tech, and tech folks are in great demand. So we have to build that connection to the mission, because it really does provide something different, that you get to serve a community in addition to building really cool stuff, right? So we do a lot of communicating around what we're doing, why we're doing it, how it serves the mission. And we engage our clinicians as well as like operating partners throughout the system in product development. We have, like an operating cadence that is weekly business reviews, monthly business reviews, lots of close partnership in terms of like gathering requirements, understanding what problems they're trying to solve throughout the entire development process, throughout all of the campaign development that we do in marketing, throughout all the work that we do in digital experience. So they're all just like, we handle it from a culture standpoint to bring folks together around shared objectives. We handle it from an operating cadence perspective. We handle it from a communication perspective. We kind of tackle it from all sides to make sure that we can bring folks together in the right way to get the outcomes that we need.
No, that's awesome. It's like an omni-channel approach internally as well. Like that's really cool. You actually talked recently, and it was on another podcast, but basically about this project that the team has completed now. You've kind of hinted at it already. It's what's going to lead to this personalization and such. It's basically around the unique digital identities for consumers or the community, really. Explaining that the consumer or the patient's digital identity could be the foundational piece to unlock this personalization and omni-channel approach. I'm curious, could you unpack that a little bit for our listeners? What was the project? What can it lead to? And what are you thinking about it for the future?
Sure. So the way it started was, again, a pretty simple problem, which is that in order for us to get folks online with us and get them to start engaging with us, we need to remove some of the friction associated with all of these interactions. And one of those areas is around login. Right. And so we started down this path of doing a single sign-on project that was we called Simple Patient Identity. And ultimately, we ended up kind of building this middleware layer that helped us connect all of our different instances of our EMR. And then we started to build on top of that and say, okay, well now, that single identity provides a place to land data about an individual that's not just their clinical data, right? Because we've abstracted it out of the EMR, we've pulled it out, and we can understand who they are in terms of their psychographic data. We can understand how they're behaving on our web properties and what they're looking for, and we can start to, kind of build a much broader picture of who they are and eliminate some of the fragmentation on the experience side of things, but also eliminate it on the data side of things. So, we've got this promise of know me, care for me, ease my way. That's what the Providence promise is. This is all about know me, right? And so we started to do that. And when you abstract the identity out and you start thinking about the person holistically, not just within your environment, you can also think about it much broader than that. And so we started thinking about identity federation to the ecosystem. So other third parties, you mentioned Mike McSherry and Zelf, like we can work with them on all of the products and services that they enable. We can do both one-way and two-way authentication in terms of like folks sending us an authentication token and then triggering a clinical action, or us sending data back to them. And so it really creates this holistic picture of how folks interact. And what that does is, again, like we need to take in the signals about an individual, understand what they're looking for, from an intent, motivation, preference, and then clinical appropriateness side of things, and then serve up to them things that are relevant to them. And so that's the whole premise of identity driven engagement, is once we can understand them, we can create a profile around them and then build, recommendations and experiences that connect to that make that experience much more relevant to them. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we can do is actually start to understand like what works for people and what doesn't work, right? And so when you have that insight into what works for a given individual and what doesn't, you can tailor programs. There's a much more clear ROI associated with it. So you're not just like throwing random crap at the wall, or like trying to, or just like, even just, kind of indiscriminately spending because you don't know what works, right? You can actually be much more targeted. And so then it's like a virtuous cycle, right? You've got identity, you've got these experiences, you've got the insights, and they can all kind of inform one another. So that's what we're working toward now.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so cool. Like, I think this is the first time that I've actually heard of like a real concrete strategy around outreach and using the, content appropriately to make sure it's relevant to what they're actually searching for, or how they're browsing the web, for instance. It's really cool.
Yeah, and it can manifest in all sorts of different channels, right? Again, so it's not just about one single front door. This kind of personalization framework can power our outbound marketing. So we can understand today who's in the market for a specific service, and then we can target them and reach out to them proactively to say, hey, like these are the services that you can engage in. We do web personalization. So the things that show up on our websites are different depending on your previous interactions with our website. And we can serve it up in our mobile app, which has the richest authentication experience, right? And it can show your individual, Alan's individual primary care provider and his upcoming appointments and connection into your patient portal, your MyChart, where all of your records and everything are. So we can do this across multiple channels and multiple modes of interaction.
Mm-hmm. So cool.
So Sara, when we think about innovation and digital in particular, there are certain, communities that come to mind. So I think Providence has been an early investor and member in Avia, avid participant, Scottsdale Institute, and many others. And it kind of feels like this sort of collaboration and innovation is kind of more common in healthcare almost than some other industries. Why do you think that is, especially since I guess sometimes you're competitive with other health systems, yet sometimes you are collaborating in these things. So what role do you see these innovation ecosystems or hubs playing in helping you accelerate innovation efforts at Providence?
So there's a lot of things that we could hit on here, but I'll just say two things. You mentioned competition. In general, like we don't compete too much, right, around these types of efforts. Yes, we may compete from a care delivery perspective, but these kinds of things we share freely, and it's because we don't really compete with each other that much, right? Like I could call somebody in Michigan today and they would share with me and I would share with them. So the competition aspect of it is one thing. And I think the other piece of it, which is that health systems realize that we alone can't kind of stem the tide of like massive disruption, as well as the influence of like these payer providers, the payviders that are really changing the dynamics of how care gets both paid for and delivered, and that we need to come together to solve some of these big problems. And so there's an acknowledgement around that as well, which creates a really healthy, to your point, like community around sharing and solving problems together. And it has, for instance, really accelerated Dex care in terms of traction and how it can, really get in there with health systems proactively to solve their problems based on their experience with us, and then translating out to other IDNs.
Mm-hmm.
Makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, Sara, I really wanted to pick your brain on this, just given your background in health policy. I've seen, throughout different podcasts, different forums, you've shared basically your thoughts around how current incentive models may slow innovation, but your take on it, at least, is, rather than shying away from that, why don't we embrace the idea that innovation can actually create opportunities to deliver new capabilities that can power new business models, which I know you've briefly touched on so far in the conversation. So I'm curious, why do you believe it makes more sense to pursue innovation that might not fit so nicely with today's business models? And how do you think business models in the future might adapt to accommodate some of the changes in new technologies that you're building?
It's a really it's a good question. It's an open-ended one, so I'm trying to give a good answer. But maybe I'll just put it this way: there isn't, the way that the current business models work isn't working. It doesn't work for consumers. It doesn't work for deliverers of care, and we're seeing sometimes the market speak for itself, right? The amount of traction that like a lot of direct-to-consumer businesses like Hims and Hers, for instance, have gotten with consumers, it's showing that like the people are hungry for something different. And I'll just say this, like in service to our mission and serving communities, like we've got to lean in to tackle this head first, like fee for service and even value-based care, which is, we've been talking about it for 20 years. And like, how much momentum do we really have around it? Like they're not solving the problem. And so, we beat our heads against the wall repeatedly, but I think there's just like this, like the problem's not going away. So we just need to keep diving in. That's how we see it.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
It always strikes me, I mean, to your point, there are a lot of these direct-to-consumer businesses and companies now that are trying to almost like disintermediate the provider-patient relationship. But I just don't think that's going to work long-term. They'll never be able to do it better than a system like a Providence. So, I mean, good luck to them, but I think it's a little bit short-sighted probably for some of them to think they can just get rid of that.
Well, I think what's really going to happen is that the connectivity between these systems, like all of these different players, is what's really going to matter. I don't think that health systems are going to be everything to everybody going forward. There is that's not what we've done that historically and it just isn't really working, right? And so I think that's going to change. And it's going to put health systems in a position for us to be much more about like, how do we become the connector and the information company and the sort of provider of that continuity around a specific person's problems, as opposed to let's just own it all ourselves. And so, so those folks that don't want to play in that environment, I think will struggle. Like the companies that are like, oh yeah, we just want to completely be separate from that. I think that will be tough, partly because like there is trust in the health system. And that relationship with your doctor, if you have one, and so there, there's some intrinsic value there. And of course that's changing too, right? Like a lot of young people don't have primary care providers, or they get their care from a much more episodic sort of transactional place. And so that's going to change too. But I think ultimately for the betterment of the community, like we've put all this money into healthcare and our outcomes still suck, right? And so the continuity around solving an individual's problem is the direction that everyone's going to need to take, as opposed to just like disintermediating for the sake of disintermediating.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can we ask a bit about your thoughts on like health equity and the digital divide? So I'm biased. Alan and I are biased because we're in the tech world, and I guess you're probably biased too, being in tech and digital. But my whole thing has always been, we won't get 100% adoption or penetration today, but adoption will only keep going up, accessibility will only keep going up. So we're on like the right curve. But again, I do appreciate in the moment though, we don't like inequities in healthcare, especially as a digital person. I don't like if digital creates inequities. So how do you sort of balance that, being sort of a digital leader, knowing that it's not, 100% just yet?
I agree with you. I don't think it means that we need to like shy away from digital, because it can, there are still digital disparities as well. So we need to keep pushing forward, but we need to do so in a way that's mindful of like the underlying health equity and equity issues that persist in our society. So for instance, like we are now working on full translation, like Spanish language translation and other language translation on our digital property, so we can lean in on like language and issues, for instance. The other area that we've started to be mindful about and think about is like in environments where data is a factor, right? Operating our digital platforms in ways that require less data. So in SMS or, other kind of things like that. So continuing to push forward, but doing so with an eye on like the considerations and learning along the way. Frankly, we know very little at this point. And so I don't want to like, have an arrogance about like we've figured it out or anything. We're just at like the baby stages of this from our perspective around digital and how it supports health equity. So, but those are some of our early things that we've done.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So Sara, I wanted to get your take on, this is a question we ask a lot of digital leaders, but today there is this explosion of patient-facing innovations, and you're obviously leading a lot of that effort. You've probably come across them all, like chatbots and digital care journeys, remote patient monitoring, et cetera. I'm really curious, what is the most exciting to you today?
So it kind of connects to our conversation around identity, but it's the ability to bring these things together actually is what excites me in a consumer friendly way. So we could bombard people with like so many different tools, so many different pieces of content, so many different ways to engage, and like what actually matters to them. And you can do that by knowing who they are and personalizing it to them, and then supporting their kind of navigation through this morass of whatever is out there, right? Those are the kinds of things that really excite me, because again, they're like focused on the outcome and delivering value to the individual, as opposed to just like a nifty thing that exists out there.
Yeah, totally. I love that answer, because it's not the flashy answer, but it's the one that's most impactful and valuable, right?
That's right. There very little sizzle, mostly steak here.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. Speaking of steak, I wanted to throw this question in there. You're involved in so many different ventures. You're a board member at Dex, you're an advisor, you're an operator at Providence in the Digital Innovation Group, but you're also the co-founder of Yeah Boy Hot Sauce. And so I was really curious, what's the genesis of that company?
Well, it came about on a trip many years ago, and we, my partner and I, we ate something that we really enjoyed, and we tried to find it in stores, couldn't. And he got a little bit obsessed, and so started to try to recreate it, and we ate a lot of hot sauce, some of it good, some of it not so good, while we figured this out. He's an engineer, so he went about it through this like very engineering oriented product development approach. And when we landed on something that we really liked, we were like, maybe other people will like it too. So our friends liked it. We started to sell it, and the rest is history.
That's so cool. No, that's great. We'll have to grab some. I'm a big hot sauce enthusiast, so it's so
awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, you definitely should.
Awesome. Well, just being mindful of your time, Sara, let's shift over. We call it the Fast 5 lightning round. It's 5 questions to get to know you better for our audience. First question that we have is, what is your favorite book or book you've gifted the most?
My favorite book is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And people always think like that's a really weird choice. But what I love about it is that it just strips down like what is, like what existence is to like its most basic thing, which is like the love between two people, in this case, the father and the son. And it just really hit me like as that's what matters. So
yeah, I love that. I mean, based on your philosophy background, right? Like that makes sense. I've seen the movie. I haven't read the book actually, but
the book is infinitely better.
Yeah, I've heard. That's awesome. Second question is unique for you, Sara. I've heard that before getting into healthcare, you were considering a career in music. Is that true? And then if so, which instrument were you playing?
So I play piano. I've been playing piano since I was 5, and I was a classically trained piano player. And when my hands didn't really grow to the size that most concert piano players need to be able to play some of the classics, I sort of became a hobby.
Cool. You were thinking maybe healthcare could extend my fingers or
maybe.
something. Yeah, something down that avenue.
Healthcare is more welcoming for hands of all sizes, apparently.
Yeah, that's right.
That's good. Question 3 is a bit different. Would you rather have super strength, super speed, or the ability to read people's minds?
Definitely reading people's minds.
Okay. We do have a follow-up. If you couldn't turn that off, would you still choose that answer?
Yes.
All right. First time, yes. Wow.
Very good. Question 4, what do you believe in healthcare that others might find insane?
That is such a good question. I think we need to completely break down how we pay for care. And I don't think value-based care is the answer.
Very interesting. I love that. Last question that we have is pandemic kind of related question. What is one hobby or activity you've gotten into since the beginning of the pandemic?
The biggest thing is, so I did it before too, but I continue to kind of cook all sorts of different things, and I've gotten a little bit more experimental and yeah, spending more time there. I also have really gotten into my plants, so I talk to them.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, there's no other way. Yeah.
No.
With your cooking, I imagine you're using your hot sauce a lot. Like, is it pretty much a given that your food is going to be spicy? Or let me ask, are all the hot sauces spicy or?
No, well, they have some level of spice. Our jalapeno is pretty mild, actually. I would give it like a 2 out of 10.
Oh, nice.
And the habanero, which is the spiciest, is like a 7 out of 10. So they're intended to be more flavor than just heat.
Right. Oh, that's great. Awesome. Well, Sara, thank you so much for coming on the show today. For folks listening, you can find Sara on Twitter. I hope I don't butcher this, but it's @NoodleV.
Yes.
On Twitter.
You got it.
Awesome. And that's a wrap for this episode of The Digital Patient hosted by Seamless MD. If you like the podcast and you want to learn more, please visit www.seamless.md. Thank you, Sara, again, for sharing your time on the show today. We really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you both. It was really fun. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Sara.